Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. There's a movement afoot in American education to restore the teaching of civics in a way that presents America as lovable, worthy of its citizens' service. Catholics are actually well positioned to join in this movement, but what we need now is for Catholics to do so eagerly. Dr. Tom Harmon, professor and Scanlan Foundation Chair in Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, joins us to talk about this. Tom, thank you very much for being with us. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me back.
Always a joy to reconnect with you. I'm also very grateful to hear your thoughts on this matter. Now, I want to begin, as I think we all should, by addressing one of the elephants in the room pertaining to this discussion, which is the numerous Catholic intellectuals who have been claiming that there is no real way that faithful Catholics can contribute to a true love of the founding and the constitutional framework of the United States. And therefore, a civic education from a Catholic perspective is difficult. Can you please comment on that?
Well, I would say that it's always difficult, actually. These are tensions that we're not going to wish or even pray away, I'm afraid. So it's just true that there weren't a whole lot of Catholics there at the founding. And so we have to be, cognizant of that, and that definitely calibrates how we should look at it. But I also think that shouldn't allow us to be, too cynical about what was going on also. It was obviously a founding that eventually led to a situation in which Catholics have been able to contribute at all levels of our country's life and even lead. So I think that any just and honest appraisal of the founding has to take into account not only the absence of Catholics at the beginning, but the ready welcome and inclusion of Catholics over our history.
And I think that's about as balanced a take on the issue as possible, because we don't want to err on the side of an overt Catholic baptizing of the history of the United States, but at the same time, the reverse, or the converse, I should say, of this theonomic kind of integralism, or what we need is a Catholic political order. That's what's really warranted. We don't want to err on both sides of this extreme. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, I mean, politics is always the art of the possible, and I think that trying to turn the American experiment into a Catholic polity would be probably more harmful than beneficial. So I think that what's possible is for us to have a real place in America, and even to have an extraordinary effect on the fabric of American life. But yeah, I think it would be a mistake for Catholics to want the church to take over and to turn it into something that it really isn't at the moment. So that would be a form of utopianism, I think, and that's not going to be a route that is going to lead to a lot of good.
So what would be a good route then? How should the modern Catholic striving for virtue, and frankly, even the virtue of patriotism, think about their role in the United States?
Well, I think the first thing to say is just that we should appreciate the political form that we have here. What we have is a nation that houses a republic, and it's very wisely put together just on the level of a civic constitution. And that itself affords us a great deal of possibilities that aren't available in other political communities. And so I think the first attitude is just to be grateful for the setup that we have here that allows us to live out our earthly life with a greater than average chance for political flourishing. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is that, of course, the Catholic faith is not something that imposes, modes and orders in politics. It works primarily through the formation of consciences and individuals. It works through the preaching of the gospel, through the sacraments, and through the various institutions that Catholics have founded that have a very powerful, although indirect, civic effect. And I think our main work, really, as Catholics, is in the strengthening of ourselves, of our families, of our communities, and of all of the institutions that we belong to.
I agree, and I think that also sets the framework for us to think about the education in civics. Why is that crucial, especially civic education about the United States history and founding?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've argued recently is that there's a tendency among Catholics to want to live in the abstract. Mm-hmm. And I'm a theologian, so I spend most of my mental life living in the abstract. So I understand the tendency, and we need that kind of theoretical perspective in order to properly judge our surroundings. But also it can tend to lead us to be sort of aloof and out of touch with the actual circumstances that we live in and that our neighbor lives in. And we are commanded to love our neighbors. And to love your neighbor really means that you have to know what your neighbor is about and who he or she is. And one of the main things that is relevant about your neighbor is the fact that in this country, they're Americans. And they've been shaped by America's laws and customs and history and the language we all share. And to be ignorant of those things, even going down to the various particulars, would be to hamper us in our ability to carry out our Lord's commandments. And so a civic education, I think Catholics need to think about it in terms of both expressing their own humanity and their vocation to love their neighbor.
You grounded that entire answer in the fact that as Catholics, we have a tendency of living in the abstract. As a fellow theologian and commentator, I can understand that. Why the need to make sure that what we are learning in the abstract can change very practically how we live our prudential moral lives?
Yeah, I think that the first thing to say is just that I think we need to be aware of our surroundings and what the needs of our neighbors actually are. And I think that viewing our neighbors' circumstances will actually allow us to be more reflective about what we need as well. So I think that actually getting involved in your communities outside of the parish. The parish is wonderful, and you need to be very involved in your parish. But it's also important to be involved in the other institutions that make up civil society as well, and to be aware of whether they're flourishing or not. And boy, I mean, I know I'm quite aware that sometimes those institutions are in pretty bad shape. And you do have to exercise some prudence about which of them are possible to help and which really should be left alone while we found alternatives. So I think that a lot of people, especially, I mean, this is something that the Catholics have been historically very good at, as a matter of fact. We've got the greatest alternative hospital and school system that's ever been created outside of a government. And so I think that we've got history of being able to exercise prudence in that respect. And we have to do so.
And one of the ways in which we do so is making sure that we're raising our children with a proper concept of history, a Catholic read of history, which is a realist read, not an utopic idealist read, but also not a hypercynical one.
That's right, exactly. And again, I think that one of the main things that we have to make sure that we're doing is exercise that virtue of gratitude. You know, Thomas Aquinas is now among, especially online Catholics, very famous for saying that there are three proper subjects for piety. It's your parents, God, and also your country. And the reason why we have to have piety for those things is because we owe them more than we can ever pay back. And our country really provides the situation or the condition for the whole rest of our life. And that's
so let's pause right there. I'm talking with Dr. Thomas Harmon, professor and Scanlan Foundation Chair in Theology at University of St. Thomas in Houston, and he's sharing with us about Catholic education needing civic formation. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Augustine. I'm talking with Dr. Thomas Harmon. He is professor and Scanlan Foundation Chair in Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. Thomas, you were telling us earlier about why it's so necessary for us to cultivate a sense of gratitude as we think about a proper education in civics. And we got cut off in the break, so if you could pick up your thought there.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that probably most of your audience is aware that not, let me say this in a nice way, not all of the rest of the educational system is that enthralled with the United States of America or American history. And I don't want to paper over our flaws or anything like that, but I do think that it's a disservice to our children to present only the flaws. And to a large degree, I think that is what tends to happen in establishment educational spaces. So I think that it's good for Catholic schools to be able to present something about America and American history that allows our children to come to love their country. And we all want to love our country, and there are things that are genuinely lovable about America, and we should show those things. And so I think that a really important goal of civic education is actually showing children what it is that's lovable about America. And it's really, I think that the kind of deconstructive attitude that happens in a lot of classrooms really cuts against the desire of our children to be good citizens. They would really prefer to drop out of being citizens. And so it's really love that's the path forward for forming good citizens who will be even more inclined, perhaps, even to take care of some of those flaws that they might learn about.
And that's also precisely why we have an obligation to study history from a global perspective. I know this because as an immigrant from a British and Asian nation, and having studied the history of both, and from a very anti-American perspective, I must say, it's very clear that the great American experiment has tremendous advantages, especially for freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and speech, that other constitutions simply don't afford. And so the gratitude here can also be greater accentuated by realizing what we have that others don't.
That's exactly right. Of course, we've got our problems. Americans have for the most part been welcoming to Catholics, but not always, obviously. And there are ways in which even our Constitution, perhaps if we were to design it from scratch, we might tweak here and there. But it's very good, and we ought not to let the good be the enemy of the perfect, or the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so that gratitude ends up being a very important framework in which I think we can very productively and much more productively approach the various shortcomings.
Thomas, why do you think we do that? It's not like we live in an idealistic era in history for us to afford to make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that you mentioned earlier the conversation surrounding integralism, mm-hmm. and I think it would be obviously it's a kind of fantasy. For some people, a pleasant fantasy that the whole political order would be subordinated to the ecclesiastical order. And I think that's a way of getting around or trying to get around real political problems. I mean, honestly, even if we did that, there would still be a lot of problems. Mm-hmm. And perhaps even some problems that are new that we haven't anticipated before. If you take a look at a lot of the European countries with national churches, the churches in those countries are pretty unpopular. And so I do think it's an important question to ask whether we would like to tie the popularity of the church to the popularity of the government. So you take a look at someplace like Poland, mm-hmm. which for obviously much of its history, the church been decoupled from the government, and the church's popularity is very high. So I think that it's a good and important thing for those two things to be distinct. I won't say separate, of course, but distinct. And the ways that we can improve things in America is really through improving, again, ourselves, our families, the various institutions, and even the political institutions that we participate in and sometimes lead. So I'll offer one kind of blindingly obvious example. I do think that the Supreme Court of the United States has been improved by Catholic participation. So many of the Supreme Court justices are Catholics, and we have been able to contribute something uniquely valuable from our Catholic intellectual tradition, namely focus and a very sophisticated and high-level focus on the ways in which the natural law relates to the human law. So there's just one example where I think Catholics have been able to contribute something of great value to the American experiment.
I'm not trying to sound overtly nationalist, but I wonder if a big part of why we fail at doing this well is a kind of, I'm going to call it retrospective hubris, that we see now what was not so clear then, and so we have a certain pride about how we think. But I mean, as one who studied Malaysian Constitution and British Constitution, and who read the history and constitutions of, say, India and the Philippines, and I have to tell you, when I encountered the American founding documents and political documents, there's no way around it. These men were geniuses. But also the deep Catholic underpinnings that they didn't even realize they were appealing to just come out when you have a Catholic sacramental intellectual worldview.
Well, it just so happens, of course, that for a long time in Western history, the Western world simply was Catholic. And so it's just that our institutions and even our most towering geniuses and artists were just marinating in a culture that was deeply formed and shaped by Catholicism. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us that even non-Catholics who inherited that tradition would be expressing in, very interesting and sophisticated ways parts, and sometimes more than just parts, of that tradition. And we can find that, deeply embedded in aspects of the American way of life. Because I do think that one of our temptations is to look back at our founding and to simply zero in on one aspect of the whole, mix that was present there, say philosophic liberalism, which obviously was developed in a milieu that was sometimes unintentionally, sometimes quite intentionally opposed to the Catholic tradition. But there were many other elements. There were elements of biblical religion, which we can't say was entirely opposed to Catholicism. There were elements of the classical tradition, which, by the way, was filtered mostly through Catholic intellectual life, an inheritance of Cicero and Plutarch and the Roman legal tradition, and even advances in the Middle Ages in politics that led in part to early modern constitutionalism, which so shaped our founders. So there's all sorts of wonderful gems and nuggets buried in our founding that we can find and we can enjoy and that we can work to cultivate more and more. And so that is, I think, part of the Catholic vocation to improve this particular civic order, is to draw those things out and to help even some of our fellow citizens who aren't aware of them to be aware of them. And to go back again to the example I used of the Supreme Court, I think that's what Catholic Supreme Court justices have been very actively doing.
We've got about 2 minutes, and I'm going to open with a can of worms here, that if you could also comment on, I was shocked to realize, even amongst Catholics, how terribly myopic our concept of not only history, but world affairs and global constitutions and frameworks, the Catholic education is, or at least the average Catholic person is. Can you share why that's a detriment and why more study would generate more appreciation?
Well, I'm surprised that only now have we opened a can of worms. This is usually a topic that has many of them. Yeah, I would say that the reason that's a problem is just because, obviously, anything that's super familiar to you, I mean, familiarity breeds contempt. And if you're so close to something that you can't see the forest for the trees, then you might have a distorted view of it. And that is a temptation. We're so familiar with our own customs and history that we become, and this is sort of human nature, I think, we kind of hyper-focus on the problems. And a more global or world historical perspective can, I think, really help us to place things in their proper context. And you can say, okay, yeah, fine. This part over here, that's not so good. But taken as a whole, the whole is very good. And I do think that kind of study is very salutary for Catholics because it shows us that politics and the goods involved in politics are themselves imperfect. And we're actually never going to have a perfect political order. But comparative study can show you where, in many respects, the order that we have and that we've inherited is really very, very good and much better than many of the alternatives.
Thomas, as usual, tremendous joy, and you nailed it just on time, too. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
My guest has been Dr. Thomas P. Harmon, professor and Scanlan Foundation Chair in Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And we've been talking about why Catholic education needs a broad, global, frankly, framework of civic education done from the perspective of virtuous gratitude. Stay tuned for the next hour. I'm Marcus Peter.